Whitney Young was the executive director of the National Urban League from 1961 to 1971. And those 10 years, if you know your history, you'll know how important they were. He served as bridge and interpreter between Black America and the businessmen, the foundation's executives, the public officials who comprised the white power structure. That's why I share here Whitney Young Sr., bridge builder, bridge builder. This was the book that was my primary source. I have it here on the altar table in front, and I will put this book back on our bookshelves in the office so that you can get it as well. Please overlook all the scribblings and the margins that I did, but that's what I do when I have a real book with pencil. It was my primary source, and it was published in 1989 and it's written by Nancy Wise. It's very good. This is Whitney Young Jr.'s family. His father was Whitney Young Sr. Mother was Laura Ray Young. His older sister was Arnita, and his younger sister was Eleanor. There's a family picture of them. You see Whitney there? Now, Whitney grew up on the campus of Lincoln Institute. This was a boarding school for blacks in rural Shelby County, Kentucky. This school was actually started by, there were folks in a board of trustees for another white school that knew that they could not accept black students there, so they said, let's start another school, a boarding school for black students where they can come and they can learn the skills they will need to get for the jobs they will need to get. So they started this Lincoln school, a boarding school, and it was really, it was near Shelbyville. 8 miles was the nearest big town for it, Shelbyville, or big enough to have stores and things like that. Also, Louisville was the nearest city. That was 22 miles to the west. So it was a little bit isolated. It was out there by itself. And so Whitney Young grew up in a very unusual situation. He grew up in a school where his father became the principal. And in that school, they had both, the faculty was integrated. Now, many of the white teachers were kind of like, saw this as a mission effort. You know, it was a little bit patriarchal, but they came and they were there too. And his dad was their supervisor. So this is how he grew up, in this kind of setting. So he did not see a lot of the things that children that grew up in, when I did here in Statesboro in 1950 saw. He just didn't see those things going on much in the place where he's growing up. Eventually he did. Eventually he did, though. This was where when he was 8 years old, though, is the first time he experienced anything like racism. His dad took him to the old Shelby Theater in Shelbyville, Kentucky, the nearby town. Now, this looks very similar to what I saw when I was attending, would go to the movies, and Sherry and folks from Statesboro, when we would go to the movies, this is what it'd be like. Now, there's plenty of seats, as you see, still down here in the bottom part. But, of course, there was the balcony, the one edge, the area of the balcony. And when he got there, he didn't know that. He'd never been to the theater. So his dad was paying for the money. He walked right on into the regular lobby. Well, of course, the folks there got very upset with him. So, oh, no, 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 and shoot him away, you know. And he went back out. His dad was very upset. So, oh, no, no, son, no, no, you don't do that. That's not what we do, because he was worried about him. And so he felt, oh, my dad's upset with me. And then he was taken to the side steps, to climb up the steps, to go to the other area, which was not kept very clean. And that's where they watched the movie. Now, his daddy later tried to explain that to him, but that he had no understanding of it until then. Of course, experienced a lot more later on. Now, this is Laura Ray Young, his mother. Let me tell you a little bit about her. In addition to raising her children and doing whatever she could for the community, she was the postmistress at Lincoln Ridge, so she was also a working mother. Lincoln Ridge was one of those things that did have a post office, although there wasn't much town, kind of like Register has a post office, you know, even though the stores are closed up there. So it did have a post office, and she was the postmistress of Lincoln Ridge. By her example, Laura taught her children about the possibility for open defiance of the conventions that governed the separation of the races. She was an example. Let me tell you how she did it. When she would go to Shelbyville or Louisville, she persisted in using the restrooms that were marked for whites only. She would march right on in there with her kids. She would use the drinking fountains intended for whites. Not only that, she tried on the clothes in the stores. All right? She refused to allow people to call her by her first name when she was there and other places. So she had open defiance of these kind of things. He was raised in that kind of an environment. And that you'll see that that makes a difference in how he lives his life. This was his dad. I could do a whole sermon on his dad, but I won't, because we're talking about Whitney Young Jr., and Whitney Young Sr. wasn't a Unitarian, so we're not going to do him today. But he was in a unique position. As the president of Lincoln, and that's a whole other story how I even got there, he presided, though, over an integrated staff. That was a very unusual thing for someone like that. He was a skilled diplomat who knew how to negotiate in the world of Kentucky politics in order to secure funds for the school. He knew he needed the money. Well, what does he need to do to keep the money rolling in, right? And the money's coming from this board, this white board. Now, he gave his children explicit rules about to guide their lives in a world of prejudice and discrimination. Let me tell you a little bit about this. This is something Eleanor observed. She said, one of the children said, we didn't see a father who had a white boss. So they didn't experience that. They saw a father who was a boss of white people and black people. She said it didn't strike us to think that we couldn't be boss when they were growing up. Now, what he would do when the board member was come to visit, this school is supposed to be for people to learn to do the jobs that they're supposed to have. So they learned the women, they learn how to cook, they learn how to sew, they learn how to do, maybe a little reading and writing that they'll need to follow the patterns and things, you know, but not a lot of academics, but learn how to do these skills. The boys learn how to do the farm work. Well, Whitney Young, and then there was a teacher prep program for students to go that maybe were going to become teachers later on and go to the schools that would help them. So it was a little more academic. Whitney Young Sr. said, no, they should all be taking those classes. So he had them all taking those more academic classes. And when the board would come to visit, they knew what they were supposed to do. He knew they were coming. The children went to their other sections, went out into the fields, and did their stuff while the board was walking through. They played that game, got the funds, and continued on their way. Now, he had something, though, he taught his children that also you can see how it affected Whitney Young Jr. later in life. His chief injunction to them was that they were not to hate whites. He said, you're not to hate them. Hatred, he said, is an expression of fear. And if you hate, it's just showing that you're afraid. Arnita remembers, he said, never let anyone drag you so low that you hate. So this was one of the main things he expressed to them. Let me share with you a little bit about Whitney Young Jr.'s education. When he was very young, his mom had him tutored. So she knew he was a bright kid, had someone there to tutor him. Then he attended a model school for black children in a nearby small community when he was in elementary school. There were enough faculty there, black faculty, that had children that had to form a school right there in Lincoln Ridge. And so it was a model school for these children. Got a very good elementary education. And then, of course, he went to the school where his dad was, Lincoln School. He graduated as valedictorian at age 15. After that, he was going on to college. Where could he go? There were 2 schools in Kentucky he could go to. He went to, at that time, because all the higher ed was segregated, he enrolled at Kentucky State Industrial College. You notice most of those schools had words like industrial with them. Kentucky State Industrial College. He enrolled in 1937. He majored in science because he wanted to be a doctor, he thought. This is when he was 15 and went off to college. He said, I'm going to be a doctor, so I'm going to major in science, and he minored in education. He actually did teach a little bit, but he knew he wanted to go to medical school and he would need money. So what do you do so that you can do that? Well, he had hoped that the Army specialized training program, if he went in the Army, you know, World War II was moving along. If he went into the Army, that they would train him and he could then go to medical school. But instead, the Army sent him to MIT. They gave him tests to see what they thought he would be good at, and he did very well for engineering. So they said, we're going to send you to study electrical engineering as a preparation for assignment to a combat engineering unit. So that's where he went. Now, after graduating from Kentucky State, he was teaching and trying to save a little more to go to medical school, but as I said, Pearl Harbor changed his mind, and he enlisted. He was reluctant, though, to go into the Army. He did it basically because this was a way to get some money, but he was very reluctant because he knew that in the Army during World War II, that he would be in a unit, a black unit with white officers. And he just didn't know how he would do with that. So, when he got to MIT with his roommates, there were three other, he was enrolled, he was already in the Army, he got there to MIT, and there were three other black folks that were going to be also doing engineering. So they put him in a room and said, we'll come back later to tell you about where your room's going to be and everything. And one of them said, they're going to try to put us together. And they said, let's not do that. So when they came back, they said, we know y'all all going to walk. You probably all want to be together, don't you? And they said, no, we don't. Just put us in the rooms that have an extra space. And so that's what they did. They put them in the rooms that had extra space. Now, Whitney Young was put in a room with two other folks, two white guys. One of the white guys immediately went down and said, I want another room. I am not staying there, And they told him, so well, you're enrolled here, and that's where you are. You're going to stay there. Eventually, he became such a close friend of Whitney Young's that he asked Whitney Young to be his best man in his wedding. Wow. So, see, and this was somebody from like Alabama, Yeah. So, yeah, it can happen. Just got to get to know some folks, yeah. Now, this is a newlywed picture that I'll tell you a little bit about his wife. He met Margaret Buckner while he was at Kentucky State when they were in college together. His grades had kind of dropped. He was having a good time, actually. His grades had dropped and were kind of mediocre until after they started dating. When he started dating her, his grades went up. Her grades went down a little bit. But she was very excellent student, and she was a good influence. No, her grades stayed high enough, though. But she helped him to tutor him some and encourage him to be a good student, and he did. They decided to marry during her senior year. He came in, she was a little behind him. And during her senior year, he had a 5-day pass and came home, and they got married when he was on a holiday pass. They married on January 2nd, 1944. And then, of course, there were a lot of quick marriages then during World War II because they were going to be sent off to Europe or to Japan or over to the Pacific. So a lot of these quick marriages. He found his calling during World War II. It wasn't medicine, and it wasn't engineering. He was working with an engineering unit, but he found his calling. And let me tell you, there's a picture of him with another friend walking around, and here's his company, Company C, 1695th Engineer Combat Battalion, and they were at Versailles. You can imagine how they felt there. I don't know how they felt there. I know when Greg and I visited, I said, get me out of this place. It was just too, all the shrubberies, just all the gold and all the, woo. But anyway, they visited, so I'm glad they got that chance. I just couldn't stand it there. Greg would tell you, I said, I got to get out of this place. This is horrible. I need to learn to appreciate those kinds of things. It was hard for me, though. So he was in this unit, and what he found, I'll tell you about his calling. I said he found his calling. He found his calling in that the white officers were giving them directions. Do this, do this, do this, and being their officer-like selves. And this black battalion was saying, I don't think I will do that. No, I don't believe I will. So, that was not good. Now here you got a whole battalion. They were armed, right? And these white officers trying to do their thing, and it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't happening. So Whitney decided, he says, well, this is not good. We've got to go do this work, some way. So he went to the white officers. He said, let me see if I can help you. And he told them, he said, what these guys are needing is a little more respect. And he shared some things they could do differently as they worked with them. I think included in the negotiations was some extra cigarettes and beer maybe. But he negotiated of what and he went back to the soldiers and said, here's what we need. This is what if we can work with them, this is what we can do. And he worked it out. And every time they'd have a conflict, he'd go back and forth, back and forth. And he found out he was really good at that. He had the background and the skills. They seemed to accept him and listen to him because of his background and skills on both sides. So he thought, well, maybe this is what I need to do for my life's work. And indeed he did. I'm going to tell you about his early Urban League years. He went back at first. When he first got back, he didn't go straight to work for the Urban League. Initially, he started working on a master's degree in social work because he thought, that's what I need, not an engineering degree, not a medical degree. I need a social work degree. Margaret was already there, his wife, pursuing a master's of ed psychology. So he went to the University of Minnesota and began a master's degree in social work. One of the field experiences they had as he was at the University of Minnesota was with the Urban League in Minneapolis. And he began to see, this is a good place for me. I could work within this. His first real job with the Urban League was as Industrial Relations Secretary, and that was at St. Paul. He connected, what he was doing there was connecting with businesses to create jobs for African Americans. That was his main thing for many years, is getting jobs for African Americans. Now, his good work, because he was able to get a lot of jobs, because he would go to these businesses and he would encourage them, and he'd share with them. He'd go in a store or something. He would see count all the customers and count all the black customers, then go to the boss and says, you have this many customers here, but I saw no black clerks. Is that right? How does this fit? And he encouraged them, this will be good for business. He had them talk to their own pocketbook sometimes. This will be good. You need to step into the new world. And he encouraged them, and he was able to get folks jobs. His work in St. Paul drew the attention of National Urban League Director Lester B. Granger. This was the person in charge of the Urban League at that time. That's his picture. And Granger became his mentor. They began talking a lot, and he became his mentor. When an opening occurred for the director in Omaha, they forwarded his name. The national office actually forwarded his name. They had 5 other candidates, but he nailed the interview and was offered the job as the director in Omaha at the starting salary of $4,000. Now, that may not sound like much now, but $4,000 was a good salary back then. I know I started at something like the teaching job in the early 70s at $5,600, so $4,000 wasn't as bad as it may sound, He was very successful there, but people heard about him, began to hear about him, and he was offered the job as the founding dean of the School of Social Work at Atlanta University. And he thought about it and got some good advice from Granger. Those folks at the National Urban League, he hated to leave them. They said, well, when Granger retires, the folks were telling him, they're probably going to go outside for somebody else. So maybe you should go outside. And he thought, well, maybe so. But actually, so he got into that and was very successful at Atlanta. In fact, the school now is called the Whitney Young School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University. It's Clark. Whitney Young School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University. He made friends and enemies in Atlanta. You can imagine. He's come to the Deep South, and his wife hated it. She had not lived in a segregated society growing up, and she hated it. So fortunately, they were already Unitarians, and they thought, well, we can go to the Unitarian church. And that's what they did. So this was the United Liberal Church in Atlanta, which is now UUCG. This is what it looked like back then. Now, actually, that church had to close for a while because that church in Atlanta originally did not accept blacks. And they shut the national office said, you can't be a Unitarian church. It did. Then they changed their bylaws, you know, or whatever they did to make it, we accept anybody kind of thing. And actually, Whitney and Margaret were the very first African Americans to join and attend that church. So they were the ones that integrated this church, which is now still in Atlanta. They recently sold that building in the Round Church, and they're moving actually into a church in Atlanta that is in a very good area, Virginia Highlands area. So they are moving, and they think that they can do a lot of good work. Where they are, it was very hard to get to and just wasn't a good place for them. So they are moving to a new area. But they were the first African Americans in that Atlanta church. Now, this is a picture of the logo for the Rockefeller Foundation. Why am I bringing in the Rockefeller Foundation? Because they were very important in Whitney Young's life. The Lindsey Campbell worked for them, and he had heard Whitney Young speak at a national meeting, and he became in awe of him. And he said, we've got to connect with this fella and help him out. This is somebody that's going to be a true leader. So he encouraged the foundation to offer Whitney Young offer him a scholarship, a fellowship, I guess it would be called for that, a one-year fellowship, so that he could go, take off, leave where he was at as dean of the school, and study different kinds of things that might fill in some gaps that he might need. And sort of, to be honest with you, the hope was the Rockefeller Foundation was hoping to prepare him to become the director when Granger stepped down. So that he was sort of the Rockefeller person. And indeed, he took the fellowship, and he went to study at Harvard for a year, taking courses there that would round out his resume to get him ready for this executive job. Now, he was not the only person that was interviewed. There were 8 folks interviewed, and it was a very demanding process. But indeed, he did become the executive director of the Urban League. Greg blew up this big picture. Here he is on the cover of Time after he was in the national director. Here he is on a stamp, you know, from back when. He was 10 years as the director of the Urban League, and this was at a time when there was a lot going on. His main job, of course, what the Urban League was trying to do, they were mostly in the cities, the main thing they were doing was trying to help people with jobs, but it was also a civil rights organization because all of it goes hand in hand. All of it goes hand in hand. He began advising those in government. He met with everybody from Kennedy on and became a major advisor for President Johnson. Now, you know, if you've watched that movie about Johnson or gone to see the play, Johnson's always on the phone calling people. Well, Whitney Young was one of them who was calling on the phone. Help me out. Tell me what to do. They were not so much people, the Urban League, they were not part of that always got in marches and demonstrations. They were doing some of the other work. But he began to realize that they needed to step out too. Not just stay in the office and work with the boards and try to get the jobs and try to keep the connections with the white power structure, that it was time to step out. So in 1963, when they began organizing this march, he did become one of the big 6 to help get involved with that and organize it. And he did participate. Justin shared some of his speech with you. It was a great speech. He received, during this time and afterwards, though, much criticism from the black leaders of the civil rights movement and others as well. Because of his working so much with white folks, which he did a lot of work, and socializing, and he was a member of the Unitarian, and all this stuff, he was often thought of as a Oreo, Uncle Tom, that kind of thing. And sometimes he did some things, if you read the book, that you can see how people might, he kind of played with it a little bit. He did a little bit of in-your-face stuff with it, you know? He'd go into a big gathering and he'd kiss all the white women, you know, stuff like that. Just something like, okay, you know, I'm not going to let, you might be going to talk about me, but, you know, go ahead, whatever. So this is what he did. But to show you a little bit, but he did great work as the director of the National Urban League. So I'm going to show you a trailer from a film, a 50-minute documentary that I have on my computer, and you can get it on YouTube. It's a PBS documentary. I'm just going to show you the trailer for it because I think you can get a little bit of an inkling of what he was like as the director.
You don't get black power by chanting it. You get it by doing what the other groups have done. The Irish kept quiet. They didn't shout Irish power or Jew power or Italian power. They kept their mouths shut and took over the police department of New York City.
It was the 60s. While angry youths took to the streets, Whitney Young was in boardrooms, convincing corporate giants to hire black people.
He was able to talk to white people, particularly well-to-do white people, business people, who may have had an interest in settling racial problems, but couldn't see it themselves until Whitney Young came along and explained it to them and said, listen, you have a stake in this too.
In just 1 year, he placed 40,000 African Americans in jobs.
Whitney understood power, and he understood politics.
Whitney Young had the ear of the most powerful people in government.
Where would we be today without Medicare or Head Start? The whole panoply of educational programs established. So many of these ideas came from Whitney Young, who pushed aggressively.
He knew how to accomplish what other people were merely for.
But Whitney Young also made enemies.
A handful of those who advocate black power stood by the door and chanted, "Uncle Tom, Uncle Tom,"
and feared for his life.
Pre-dawn raid to head off an alleged plot to murder moderate civil rights leader Whitney Young.
I think that Whitney Young was a prophet. Few people understood how brilliant his vision for racial transformation of American power was.
You heard them talk about him talking about trying to use humor. He used humor a lot. That was one of his very talented things he could do. If there was a conflictive situation, he would use some good humor. Everybody would laugh, and then they would feel better and felt like they could work with one another. So when this Black Power movement came up, he was really opposed to it, and he told this joke about it, about the Irish, of course. Now later on, it got so bad, and he realized, you know, I may be on the wrong side of this. And so what he did, he decided to take on the word and sort of define it in a way that he could handle. So he said, then he began to lift up black power, but he talked of it as it empowering black folks to do the things they needed to do. And that seemed to be able to help him a little bit. He was very concerned about these threats on his life. He said, I knew the kind of work I was going to do, that I may have threats on my life, but I didn't think it would come from black folks. I thought it would come from white folks. But he was very concerned about that. Now, before I tell you about how he died and a little bit about that, I want to share with you about Whitney Young as a UU. Because we Unitarian Universalists, we tend to, you know, if somebody walks through the door a couple times, yep, they were one of us, they were one of us, let's claim them, you know, some way, sometimes. But Whitney Young really was a Unitarian, and then after that joined with it, a Unitarian Universalist when the two joined together. He was first in Omaha in 1950 through 1953. He and his wife Margaret joined the Unitarian Church there. She was a co-teacher in a Sunday school class. That was back when John Cyrus was the minister. That was in Omaha. You know, he was the director of the Urban League there. I've already told you about Atlanta. They were the first black people to join the recently resurrected Unitarian Church. They worked with ministers Glenn Campbell and Ed Cahill on many projects because the Unitarians were a lot of times the ones wanting to work on these projects. Well, there they had the executive director of the National Urban League, and he helped them to coordinate many of the things they were trying to do in Atlanta. In New York, after being chosen the national director of the Urban League in 1961, they moved to Rye, New York, and they joined the White Plains Unitarian Church. That was back when Peter Sampson was the minister. So he indeed was a Unitarian and then a Unitarian Universalist, and he and his wife were active in Unitarian Universalism. Now, I said he died in 1971. Well, what happened? He died March 11th, 1971, at Lighthouse Beach in Lagos, Nigeria, where he was attending a conference. He and many other folks were over there attending a conference. Several colleagues and friends decided that they would take a break and go to the beach. Now, he was a good swimmer. He was a good swimmer. But he somehow got caught up in the currents, and somebody saw an arm, and they went out to get him and brought him back, and he was dead when they brought him back. At first, they thought, well, he must have had a heart attack. But when they did the autopsy, they found out that indeed he drowned. And, you know, you can get water in your lungs pretty quickly if you get into some of these currents and pull under. And he drowned is what happened to him. So when he came back, though, you can see pictures on this documentary of people lining the streets, you know, and lifting him up. And so he got sort of a hero's welcome as he in death. And even some of those folks that were so mad at him lifted up the good things that he had done in his life. With these other Unitarian Universalists, I've always given you some quotes that I found that I think are maybe as good today as they were when they said. Here's some Whitney Young quotes that you might like. He says, "It is better to be prepared for an opportunity and not have one than to have an opportunity and not be prepared." He said, this is after he had kind of adopted black power. He said, "Black power simply means, look at me. I'm here. I have dignity. I have pride. I have roots. I insist, I demand that I participate in those decisions that affect my life and the lives of my children. It means that I am somebody." He said, "You can holler, protest, march, picket, and demonstrate, but somebody must be able to sit in on the strategy conferences and plot a course." He said, "Black is beautiful when it is a slum kid studying to enter college, when it is a man learning new skills for a new job, or a slum mother battling to give her kids a chance for a better life. But white is beautiful too, when it helps change society to make our system work for black people also. White is ugly when it oppresses blacks, and so is black ugly when black people exploit other blacks. No race has a monopoly on vice or virtue, and the worth of an individual is not related to the color of his skin." Now, we don't often quote Richard Nixon at the Unitarian Universalist Church, but Richard Nixon, this is the statement that he released when he found out about Whitney Young's death. "With Whitney Young's tragic death today in Nigeria, I have lost a friend. Black America has lost a gifted and commanding champion of its cause, and this nation has lost one of the most compassionate and principled leaders it has had in all the long centuries since whites from Europe and blacks from Africa began building together toward the American dream. Whitney Young," he said, "died in the full bloom of life and at the very height of his contribution to American society. His life is over, but his life's work continues." This is Whitney Young Jr. Indeed, his life is over, but his life's work continues. But who will do this work? Who will do this work? It will take many, including, hopefully, his fellow Unitarian Universalists. Who will do this work? We will. Who will do this work? We will. May it be so.